Hello and welcome to the fourth part, Section D of the digestive system for Bio 112. Here we're going to break away a little bit from that anatomy and physiology of those digestive organs and take a look at nutrition. So nutrition is going to be a sort of study by sort of the means by which organisms both obtain nutrients they need and also utilize those nutrients they need to grow and sustain life. And recall that each one of those individual cells does require some sort of metabolism. So in this discussion, we look at macro and micronutrients, some liver function, and the generation of ATP. In summary, this lecture will pull some ideas out of chapter 27 in the McKinley text, a little bit out of, I believe, chapter 3 on ATP synthesis, and some also out of chapter 26 in the McKinley text. Let's look at some of these highlights. So as we said earlier, nutrition is a study of how organisms obtain and utilize nutrients. When we say things like nutrients, we're talking about biomolecules. That means these are incredibly small, not visible with the naked eye, but nonetheless very essential to functions of cellular processes. So these are going to be including vitamins and minerals. And why do we need nutrients? We need to synthesize, in other words, create new molecules. Also, these nutrients are required for maintenance, growth, and repair. Again, millions of cells that need to go through individual metabolic processes. And we get these nutrients through the food we eat. Lastly, as a reminder, remember that water is considered a nutrient because we do need that substance on a daily basis. Here we organize nutrients into subcategories. We say that macronutrients must be consumed in relatively large quantities. That means we need daily amounts of this, and therefore we're talking about molecules such as carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And in the last few sections of the digestive system, we talked about how those molecules get broken down. In nutrition, we also have the category of micronutrients. These must be consumed in relatively small quantities. By this, we're talking about tiny vitamins and minerals. And again, these are obtained through the foodstuffs. We have essential nutrients that must be obtained and absorbed via the digestive system from the diet, and non-essential nutrients. These are going to be provided by biochemical processes of the body. In other words, the body manufactures its own substances. For example, the body has a sort of full portfolio of amino acids that it pulls from. It also needs amino acids from foodstuffs as well. So now we take a closer look at a macronutrient, in other words, proteins, lipids, and carbs. These are going to be needed to fuel cellular respiration. So if you've had biology class recently, you recall that cellular respiration is a process that all living substances go through, and the end result is to provide ATP. You might recall ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. The purpose of this molecule is that it provides energy for living things to do daily cellular functions. Well, this energy is measured in calories, and we define a calorie as the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of a substance of 1 degree in weight of water by 1 degree Celsius. And then we add a prefix to that when we say kilocalorie. That prefix kilo means 1,000, so a kilocalorie is 1,000 calories. We can also convert that calorie to 4.14 joules. Body weight of the human body is maintained when calories consumed and calories expended are in balance. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the end. Here's a helpful diagram. Always a good idea to maybe push pause on the YouTube video and read it over. Now we turn our attention to another type of nutrient, micronutrients. Here we're talking about vitamins and minerals. Primarily, we obtain these micronutrients through foods, meats and plants, being a good source of these vitamins and minerals. Each type of food we consume has a different variety of them, and perhaps you're aware that you can check the nutrition label of food stuff and see what types of vitamins and minerals are in there. Not one single food is enough to sustain all the essentials that we require. So in other words, we need diversity in our diet. And hopefully at our breakfast, lunches, and dinners, we have a variety of foods to provide all those essential amino acids, all those essential vitamins and minerals. And if we're not getting that through our food, possibly we can obtain these through supplements, such as what they call vitamins, pill form, so to speak. So you see that vitamins are simple organic molecules, and these are going to be required for normal metabolism occurring in cells again. These are going to be present only in small amounts of food. If we consume large amounts of that, that might be toxic to us. These vitamins can be water soluble or fat soluble, essential or non-essential. Let's take a look now at those water soluble vitamins. As you probably are aware, the word water soluble means that it can dissolve in water. An example, B vitamins and vitamin C are water soluble. That means they can easily be absorbed into the blood from the digestive tract. We might recall that the blood is primarily consisting of water. Any excess vitamins will be excreted in the urine. We'll talk about that a little bit in the urinary system coming up. In addition, some coenzymes assist with normal enzyme function. So when we talk about enzymes and coenzymes interacting, this is the bridging the gap of the information that we see these coenzymes and enzymes are actually vitamins and minerals in food. As we compare and contrast essential and non-essential vitamins, we see that essential vitamins are necessary from the diet. We need to obtain those from outside sources. If we have a deficiency in our diet, we have problems. Our bodily functions are impaired. So vitamin C, we obtain that for items like carrots or oranges, vitamin A, so on. We also have non-essential vitamins. These are going to be cofactors that the body produces and recycles as needed. So as we see in some of the biochemical activities, NADH and FADH2 are cofactors. They're going to be intermediate molecules in that respiratory process. And from vitamins, we turn our attention to minerals, and we can subcategorize these minerals as major or trace minerals. All minerals are essential and must be obtained from the diet we consume. Major minerals, we see that we're talking about more than 100 milligrams per day required. These are things like calcium, chloride, potassium, phosphorus, etc. So take, for example, we talk about calcium ions in muscular contraction. Also, minerals can be trace minerals. By this, we're talking about less than 100 milligrams per day required. In other words, we need tiny amounts of copper, iodine, zinc, iron, and so on. So I think it's interesting personally that the iron that might be in the pipes or plumbing or in our cars is a similar element that we need for the center of a hemoglobin molecule. Iron is used for that. So it's interesting how these basic elements are used by the human body, just as the world around us. For example, the zinc that is coating the zippers on our jackets, similar zinc that's in our body. So these minerals are stored to a varying degree within the human body. These foods that we eat are sometimes quote unquote fortified. When we say fortified, we're adding one or more essential nutrients. So for example, milk is sometimes fortified with vitamin D. that's going to help increase calcium absorption. And as we mentioned, sometimes these nutrition food labels are guidelines for adequate nutrition. Knowing how to read them can give us the amount of calories we should obtain, give us transparency and awareness with the fat, protein, and carbohydrates we take in. And on the bottom of these labels, you can see the vitamins and minerals. These are helpful for meal planning. That means a person can use this data to promote health and wellness in an individual. And those with special dietary needs, such as Crohn's disease, might be checking these nutrition facts. And so various institutions have set up an RDA, a recommended daily allowance. This is the amount of each nutrient that should be obtained each day. And this is going to be set as guidelines by federal agencies here in America. And again, we might use this data to food plan or take into consideration homeostatic imbalance, or perhaps the need to consume more of these substances, such as in athletes. Now we turn our attention to the liver. We've been talking about the liver in this chapter and in this section of the digestive system. We mentioned earlier that it has many, many functions. Last chapter or last section we focused on production of bile being one of those functions. And here we see that the liver is also responsible for carbohydrate metabolism, protein metabolism, lipid metabolism, and of course, again, there's many other functions such as drug detoxification. Let's take a look now at carbohydrate metabolism. Recall that examples of carbohydrates can be simple sugars, or it could also be complex sugars like starches, like potatoes, grains, etc. Recall that digestion of this starch begins in the oral cavity, and that's going to be catalyzed by salivary amylase. Don't forget that we also have pancreatic amylase that's going to be synthesized as well. And that's going to be a component of pancreatic juice. That's going to continue the digestion of those starch molecules into oligosaccharides and individual glucose molecules. We also get maltase, which is going to be a brush border enzyme that's going to help digest maltose into glucose molecules. Lactase is also a brush border enzyme that's going to digest lactose into glucose and galactose. And also sucrase is another brush border enzyme that's going to digest sucrose into glucose and fructose. So in other words, the main idea is taking these larger molecules and breaking them down into individual glucose subunits. Notice how these much smaller molecules enter the bloodstream and go into the blood flow, where they will be delivered to cells that need those substances. Now we turn our attention to protein metabolism. And what's going to happen here is that these proteins are broken down into amino acids, subunits in other words. And that's going to be done by enzymes that target the peptide bonds between these amino acids. Recall in digestion that pepsin is formed from pepsinogen in the stomach, and that's going to denature the proteins. We also have some enzymes that are going to break these down. And the end result is that these free amino acids are absorbed into the small intestines, and once again, they enter the bloodstream. And again, these can be incorporated into body structures, or sometimes even converted to glucose in the liver or kidneys. And our third main foodstuff is going to be lipids, fats in other words. In lipid digestion, recall that lingual lipase is secreted in saliva, and then it gets activated in the stomach. About 30% of triglycerides are digested by lingual lipase and gastric lipase in the stomach. Recall also that pancreatic lipase is going to be produced in the pancreas, and that's going to digest triglycerides in the small intestines. And recall also that in the ileum, bile salts are recovered and recycled back to the liver. So these lipids enter the epithelial lining of the small intestine, and then they are wrapped in a protein sort of coating. And then they pass through the lacteals and are deposited in the jugular and subclavian veins by the lymphatic system. So in summary, once again, the larger molecules are broken down into smaller subunits and they enter the bloodstream. In addition, other general liver function is the detoxification of drugs and also hormone breakdown. We see pigments such as bilirubin broken down as well. And lastly, it's noteworthy that nucleic acid digestion occurs, but not in the liver. That's going to be in the small intestine. We now turn our attention to cholesterol synthesis. In other words, us quote unquote synthesizing cholesterol. How do we make this important substance for the human body? Well, first off, if students would like to read more about this specific topic, you'll find more on page 1078 of the McKinley textbook. And so this synthesis is going to occur in the liver, and we're going to have fatty acids transported in blood to enter those hepatocytes. We have a breakdown of these fatty acids into smaller molecular substances. Here's a diagram showing the liver and cholesterol synthesis. Let's start by getting our bearings straight on this diagram. On the upper part of the diagram, we see a sinusoid, so that's going to have blood flowing through there. On the lower green vessel, we see the bile canaliculus. Recall that's a duct in the system. And we have the movement of bile salts. In between there, perhaps you can see this hexagonal shape shows us a liver lobule. Well, in this region, the cholesterol is synthesized within individual hepatocytes that compose that liver lobule. And following that creation, that synthesis of the molecules, they're released either into the blood of the liver sinusoids, or they're synthesized into bile salts and released as a component of bile into that bile canaliculi. It's noteworthy that not all cholesterol is bad. We have levels of LDL and levels of HDL. So here we're talking about low density cholesterols and high density cholesterols. These LDLs are going to take excess cholesterol and deposit them on interior arterial walls, which is why we call it bad cholesterol. These high density ones are going to be called good cholesterol because they transport lipids from the arterial wall to the liver. And now we turn our attention to ATP generation. Recall that adenosine triphosphate is an essential molecule in the human body. In fact, all living things require ATP to do daily energy processes. So here we go into a review of cellular respiration. And so in cellular respiration, we have four main stages. These are going to be glycolysis, an intermediate stage, the citric acid cycle, and then the electron transport system. From start to finish, we will end up with a certain number of ATP. So let's start out with the process of glycolysis. Glycolysis does not require oxygen, and that's why we call it an anaerobic reaction. What we have is glucose gets broken down in this pathway into two pyruvate molecules with an accompanying energy transform to get a transfer, to form a net production, in other words, a total amount of 2 ATP molecules and we're also going to get 2 NADH molecules. By the way, students that would like to read more on this topic are going to find pardon me, information on page 91 of the McKinley textbook. Next step, we get what's called the intermediate stage. It's noteworthy that this and the following steps are indeed aerobic, and these are going to occur within the mitochondria. And this intermediate stage involves multiple enzymes, and one of these enzymes is going to be called pyruvate dehydrogenase. And that molecule is going to convert pyruvate to acetyl coenzyme A. What happens is carbon dioxide is formed and NADH is produced. And that brings us to the third phase of ATP generation. That is the citric acid cycle. Here in this citric acid cycle, we take that acetyl coenzyme A from the previous cycle and we form citric acid. So the citric acid cycle is a metabolic pathway that occurs in the matrix of the mitochondria. And that, again, is going to be the breakdown of acetyl coenzyme A. And we're going to get a net amount of 1 ATP produced, 3 NADPH molecules, and 1 FADH2 molecules. In addition, carbon dioxide is a byproduct of this reaction. And our fourth and final step of ATP generation, we get the electron transport system. This process can be organized into 3 steps in which energy is kind of temporarily held by coenzymes NADH and FADH2. We then get a transfer of energy to form a bond between ADP and a phosphate molecule, and that's going to yield the ATP molecule. So in other words, ATP is formed through oxidative phosphorylation. In addition, other molecules than glucose can be broken down. Glycerol and fatty acids can be broken down. Recall that these fatty acids are building blocks of triglycerides. And what happens is glycerol can enter the pathway of glycolysis. It gets converted to glucose within the liver. And those fatty acid chains have long tails of carbons. These get removed to form acetyl coenzyme A. And here these molecules enter the citric acid cycle. Interestingly, amino acids can also be used to generate ATP. The amine group of amino acids gets removed by deamination, and this is going to occur in the liver hepatocytes. And again, we kind of pre-work this molecule and we change it into a format where it can enter the appropriate pathway in cellular respiration. So depending on the specific amino acid, it may enter through glycolysis. These amino acids might enter the intermediate stage, or they might be entering in that cycle in the citric acid cycle. Our last slide about ATP generation serves as a summary of cellular respiration. So again, in review, we have glycolysis, the intermediate phase, the citric acid cycle, and then the electron transport chain. In summary, we have a certain amount of ATP created. So let's look at that. This showing a total of about 30 ATP net. In other words, combine the amounts from glycolysis, combine the amounts from Krebs cycle, aka citric acid cycle, and combine the amounts from the electron transport chain, which truly drive most of the ATP production. We see a net amount of 30 ATP. Lastly, we remind ourselves, what does it take to quote-unquote stay fit? or slim or trim. Notice that it's all simply coming down to energy balance. Is going to be equal to energy consumption and energy expenditure. And that's a very general summary of how we stay fit. Of course, it's much more complicated. There's also genetics involved as well. But in summary, as we see on the right, we see energy intake and energy output, and seeing this person being in a balance, this person having an imbalance, and an imbalance as well. Lastly, it's interesting to note where the energy we eat goes to. So notice that this energy that we consume in terms of calories is used not so much for exercise. We see that's a small amount, and not so much for this item called NEAT, which means doing average daily activities such as moving arms, cooking, sweeping, cleaning, etc. And then we take into effect also thermic effect of meals. In other words, when we eat food, we have to warm that food up. And lastly, we see that most of the energy we expend is going on resting metabolic rate. What does this mean in summary? It means that roughly 50% of the calories that we're consuming out of our lunch, think of your dinner, think of your breakfast, half of those calories are simply going to keeping the body at a resting metabolic rate. In other words, just basically functioning. And the byproduct of that reaction is heat. So you might notice that humans are quite warm, and this is because most of that energy shown in red is actually lost and quote unquote wasted in the form of thermal heat. So in other words, doing things and exercise is only a small portion of our energy expenditure. So that summarizes the concepts of chapters 3, chapters 26 and 27. As always, feel free to dive into those textbooks for more in-depth information. So this concludes the digestive system. Thanks for your attention. And as always, make sure to jump on the Blackboard to review quiz questions to help us master the material.